The West isn't only guns and red dust. Every dawn a man pours 2 cups, the chipped one warmed by the steam of black coffee. Out on the porch a boy clutches a crust of bread, feet wrapped in rags, hearing the saddle jingle and breathing the scent of oiled leather. In time, that town learned how to stand up straight again. In the end, a single word was enough to change a life. Part 1. 2 cups of coffee and the empty chair. Morning comes like a thin sheet of gold dust laid over everything. The silvered fence rails, the wooden barrels, the tarp thrown across a stack of hay. On the porch the boards are crosshatched with scratches like the paths a person wears into a life. Coulter Briggs builds the fire early. Smoke climbs the flue and thins into the sage on the prairie. A tin coffee pot sits canted on the grate, bubbling as if someone were dropping secrets in one by one and letting them lift off as steam. He pours 2 cups. The first to the brim, the second only halfway. Both are tin, dulled by the sound of time. The second has a small chip in the rim, a neat little dent right where a child's fingers once braced. Coulter sets that cup in its old place just inside the bright tongue of sun crawling across the boards. He doesn't look at it long, only touches it to be sure it's steady, the way a man smooths a lapel before he steps outside. His boots stand straight by a doormat sewn from feed sacks. Coulter's calloused hand tightens the rope that keeps the porch awning from shivering. In the stall, a horse snorts. The saddle straps breathe out the smell of oiled leather. Before he steps down the stairs, he checks the silver conchos on the old saddle rig, eyes bright but scratched, still holding like the first day. The small ring of metal on metal is dry and clear, and somehow it gives the porch a heartbeat. The hill wind pushes swirls of fine dust across the yard. A little sign on the post, South Ridge, rocks and creaks with the tired sound of wood meeting the dry season wind. Coulter looks across the sloped yard toward the pasture, where clumps of barrel cactus, dark green fists, stand apart. On the sill, a wooden chair teeters with the breeze. One front leg runs short, so each time it settles, it clacks, like an old man hunting a way to sit without pain. Coulter lifts the first cup and blows. Heat runs straight up the bridge of his nose and opens a warm lane in his chest. The other cup keeps quiet. He nudges it toward the empty chair, the same distance as always. Some mornings he lets it go cold. Today he drags the chair a little closer to the table. A new scratch, hair thin, writes itself across the boards. He makes a slow circuit of the yard, cracks the ice in the water trough, and throws it aside to melt. The gray horse stamps, shakes its mane, eyes wet and dark as if it just remembered something. Coulter rubs the dark patch on its neck and says a short something, his voice no higher than the wind. He resets a stake at the edge of the grass, snugging the knot, and comes back to the porch. The second cup still smokes, but lightly. Another finger of sun has slid across to touch the chipped rim, flashing a pin of light like a blink. Coulter sits and listens to sounds so familiar they almost don't have names. Leather loosening and tightening, a hinge speaking, wind threading the knotholes far off a hammer, tapping a steady beat on metal. The damp earth smell beneath the porch mixes with coffee, an old promise you can breathe. By the door, a heavy coat with worn shoulders waits for big wind weather. Beside it, a wide-brim hat shows a crease from where it got pressed against the table corner last year. Coulter touches the brim. With his other hand, he finds the blackened chain of a pocket watch he no longer wears, a strange habit in a man who doesn't keep time. Sun up, sun down, that's all he needs. From the porch, the road into town is a red streak, salted with yellow grit. The sky, a pale blue hanging low. If anyone passes, the dust will lift and settle like it never happened. Coulter leans back against the post, tilts his head, and doesn't blink for a few beats. He hears the kitchen window rattle with wind, somewhere inside a metal spoon fall, because the table lists. The house answers in its own small language, like a tamed animal letting him know softly, "I'm here." The second cup eases toward cool. A dark brown ring gathers at the chipped edge. Coulter picks it up, doesn't drink, just weighs it, the way a man sometimes weighs his heart with a dumb piece of tin. He sets it down again and turns the handle so that Dent points toward the empty chair. The wind carries a faint thread of baking from somewhere, enough to twitch his stomach, then leave it be. He stands, steps down 3 stairs, and stops at the last, eyes out on the horizon. His right hand tugs the saddle strap once more, tightening to the right notch. Then lets go. In that small breath of time, the porch, the cup, the chair, and the morning's powder gold dust draw together on a thread finer than hair. It doesn't tie a man, just keeps a place to come back to. Coulter dabs a rag at a coffee spot on the table. He folds the rag square and sets it beside the chipped cup, like a fingertip laid over a wound that has already scarred. At the yard's edge, a mockingbird hops and cocks its head, listening. It isn't afraid of the man on the porch, as if it knows the kind of presence that never startles anything. Then Coulter eases the door near shut, takes an old burlap sack, and walks toward the feed shed. His shadow stretches across the bright ground and blends with the soft glare. The second cup stays where it is, chipped, warm enough, like a seat kept for what hasn't arrived. The chair stops rocking. The wind shifts and hushes as if it knows better. Somewhere deep in the man's chest, a quiet place is no longer so cold. It only waits for a small hand to rest there, so it won't cool again. Maes, Part 2, Warm Bread and Rag-Wrapped Feet. On Main Street, early sunlight shakes gold dust over the porch planks. The sign, Bakery, May Lark, hung from 2 short chains, clacks whenever the wind runs the alley. Inside, the cast-iron oven glows like a gentle beast breathing, sending heat that carries the smell of leaven, the sour tang of starter, and brown crust freckled with salt. The door stands ajar. The scrape of a metal peel on the rack flashes and fades, giving way to a fragrance that makes even the full-bellied pause a beat longer. Jem hides behind the porch post. His back rests against a strip of paint peeling in thin scales. He hugs a stale heel of bread wrapped in the cleanest rag he could find. It won't fill him, but it's enough to make his stomach stop clawing until noon. Old blue-green bruises at his wrist are dying down to smoke color. A north wind knifes through his torn trouser legs. He tightens his fingers, tucks both feet into the layers of burlap wrapped tight, the big toe poking out a new hole from last night. He doesn't look at the people in the shop. He watches the heat at the mouth of the oven, the air wavering like water. Every time the peel scrapes, a loaf leaves the oven's belly, settles on the steel grate, and the crust cracks, soft like sun taking hold of dry skin. That's Jem's favorite sound in the morning, bread cracking. It sounds like an unspoken promise that something has come done, warm enough to lean on. Next door is the general store. Across the way, a saloon with a lower porch roof, and a sign carved with a tilted mug. The wood holds the old, dark odor of liquor. From that direction sometimes comes a flat laugh, then chair legs whining over plank, then nothing. Each time the saloon door slaps open, a cold gust scours the street, dragging the smell of dregs and winter mud, and slapping Jem's face like a hand that isn't there. He tilts away. May passes the window. Thin figure, heavy cloth gloves, hair tied clean at the nape. She sets a loaf on the rack, presses with her thumb to test the bake, and steps back. Flour dusts the floor in a little fall of rain someone will sweep later. May doesn't look outside. She's used to a small shadow at the edge of the door in the mornings, gone by noon. That shadow is part of the street, like the ring of hammer in the air, seen but not called by name. Jem shifts a step so the sun warms his back and not his face. Heat on a face draws eyes. He chooses the eddy of wind where the oven smoke hits the porch and loops around, warming split knuckles. The heel of bread in the rag smells of old flour, dry enough that a hard sniff finds a taste of ash. He breaks a bit, tucks it in his mouth, then chews slow, like counting steps across a broken bridge. For now his belly quits hollering. The bell goes kang when a man in a heavy coat shoulders in and shakes snow from his hat. He sets a sack of flour on the counter and trades for 2 new loaves. On his way out, he sidesteps Jem on reflex. Small things like that often mean trouble. Sun slides off the boards, leaving a darker patch where Jem stands. His shadow is thin as thread tied to the post. Each time the bell rings, he starts to draw deeper into the corner, then stops. Too deep and the warmth won't reach his hands. Someone flips a coin toward him. It skitters and knocks against a step. Jem looks at the coin, then at the heel in his hand. The coin could buy something later, but later means waiting, asking, showing his face. Bread is now. He picks the coin up, slips his hand into his coat pocket, and lets it lie beside a broken button he's kept a long while out of habit. The street moves at a noonish plod, like cattle in heat. The smith hauls his forge. A teamster shoulders a sack of salt. A bootblack crouches on a step, hands blacked. Sheriff Dunn rides past, his old badge dull under the light. He doesn't stop, doesn't stare. Far out, red dust lifts and folds, as if someone tipped a hat to shade his eyes. Closer by, a bell on some saddle rings a lone note, like the minute hand taking a step. Jem touches 2 fingertips to the planks and rubs a clean spot for sitting. He drops low, still keeping his back to the post. Knees tucked, feet in rags pulled tight under his own shadow so he won't brush anyone. All around is loud enough to hide one child breathing, busy enough that no one has to ask. He watches the oven mouth glow, then the grease-dark stain on the door, the place scrubbed often and never quite clean. A gust rolls past and lifts a drift of flour dust to the porch. Jem reaches out, not to touch, just to hold his hand in the warm stream as it reaches him. The sting in his palm makes his eyes flutter like someone lay a hot cloth across his face. He remembers how to wrap rags so the heel won't blister, cross over the big toe, tuck the knot inside so it won't slip on the road. Someone once taught him that. He can't say who. He only recalls the size of the hand, big enough to shade half his foot. Inside, May pulls another run of loaves. When she leans into the heat, the breeze flips the corner of her apron and tosses a little flour through the doorway. One grain lands on the back of Jem's hand and melts into sweat. He stares at that speck, something almost no one would notice. It lies there as a private sign that he was here, in this morning, at this oven and not drifting somewhere else like a leaf. A woman pushes out the door, hugging a hot loaf wrapped in thick cloth. The crackle of crust follows her a ways. Jem lifts his head a fraction, lets his nose go after that smell the way a puppy learns to. He doesn't put out his hand. Experience says asking ruins the smell and spoils the place he's found. He only sits and holds his own small crust tighter, the last intact meaning after a lot of other meanings fell away. Near noon, the porch shade shrinks and shows his rag-bound feet. He pulls the edge of the cloth up and hides his toes. The stiff, frayed wrap scrapes his skin and stings. Beside the post, an ant shoulders a crumb of flour too big for it, staggers and doesn't quit. He follows it until it disappears into a seam in the wood, then breathes out slow. The saloon door pops. A cold blade of air slides through, carrying a laugh, thin as a dull knife. Jem tips his head, slips his shoulder another half finger into the porch's darker wedge, and keeps still, the way an old nail keeps its bite in the wood it first took hold of. In the quiet between oven loads, sparrows patter onto the shingles like a sprinkle of rain. Jem's belly shifts, then settles. The bread in his hand has lost another corner. Heat from the oven is enough for numb fingers, not enough for his knees. He closes his eyes a beat and lets his back sink into the post, letting the smell of bread hold the part of him that wants to leave. On the threshold, a pale trail of flour runs thin as chalk. He doesn't step over it. He sits close, but he doesn't touch. He only waits. Waits a little longer, the way a person waits for someone to set down something warm in front of him without asking a name. Part 3. A Beaten Man's Temper. The saloon door slapped open, the leather curtain raking the cold air like a rough hand. Harlan Cobb slipped out sideways, jacket shoulders frayed to threads, collar sour with the mix of old liquor and stale sweat. An empty tin flask thudded against his hip, clacking dryly like a coin that's lost its worth. His fist gripped the torn edge of his coat where the stitching had split like the mouth of an old cut. Things wearing out, work falling off. The last pay chit creased in his pocket where no one would bother to count it again. The steps were slick with morning damp. Young sun muddied the red dust and pasted a dirty brown on the steel toes of Harlan's boots. He paused half a beat, head tipping as if to find someone to pour his temper into. No one. Only the wind teasing a signboard, some loose reins knocking out a thin lank, and a street too tired to do more than look through him like he was a wall. He cut his eyes toward the bakery. The hot, gentle crackle of maize-brown crust touched his nose. He remembered the emptiness since last night, but the hollow that itched worst rode higher than the belly, lodged in the throat, the head. At the porch edge, a small shape tucked behind a post, shoulders hiked against the wind. Jem, feet wrapped in rags. A stale crust clutched in his hand. Harlan stepped down, his steel-capped heels knocking the stair lip, hard pick-fight sounds of metal looking to quarrel with wood. The empty flask kept time against his thigh, chiming along. He stopped right in front of the boy, his shadow swallowing the warm sun patch on the boards and shouldering the bakery heat back a hand's width. The kid lifted his face just enough to see the rim of a boot. That was enough. No question, no warning. The steel toe came up and drove forward, a straight, dull line of a thing that knew how to hurt. The hit was clean, like a hammer sinking a stake. The boy folded, arms banding his middle by reflex. His light body kicked a half step and skidding through dew on the boards. The crust jumped from his hand, rolled through dust, and stopped at the edge of a thin puddle. A white scratch cut into its brown skin. The sound was small enough to pretend you didn't hear. And they did. A man from the general store got busy with string on a parcel. The bootblack ducked lower, scrubbing hard like he could pour himself into leather instead of the moment. A market woman pulled her scarf higher and let her eyes skate the brick wall opposite. The street held its silence like it was holding on to its own face. Harlan wheezed, liquor breath meeting the cold and turning to a blunt metallic stink. He didn't say git, didn't curse. He leaned, and the empty tin smacked the porch post with a sharp objection. A speck of whitewash clung to his hair from the saloon ceiling, stark as something once clean, now smudged. He stared at the crust on the ground with the contempt he saved for things beneath a name. In his book, the world sorted out into hard or soft, down or standing. The small thing in front of him was both, hard enough not to cry, soft enough to break. The boy didn't cry. He only cinched himself one twist tighter and let the pain blow through him the way wind crosses one porch and then the next. Dust made his eyes blink. Dust, not water. One hand reached, stopped halfway, and came back to guard his belly. His chin touched the worn hem of his coat. His teeth fitted tight. His breath came coarse as a bellows when the coal's nearly gone. Harlan rocked his heel, the steel toe nudging the crust, so it spun once and lay on its back, the fishbone crack in the crust showing plain. He tipped his face to the white sky and blew a plume. There weren't words in his head, only torn lengths too short to carry meaning. This season, the boss, cattle. Those scraps rubbed and squealed together, salting his throat with bitterness. The bitterness sought a door out and found one. Behind him, the saloon door flapped once more, then quit. In the bakery, May set a fresh tray on the rack, tapped the side, flour sifting like a bit of snow. Her hand checked a beat when a long shadow covered the porch mouth. She didn't rush out. She had learned a town sometimes has to hear itself miss a breath before it's ready to call in a voice for what's right. The oven kept breathing. The dough kept rising. When it was time, things would come done. Harlan bent, not to pick up the bread, but to be sure the kid saw the boots close. A dull blade tucked in his boot shaft flashed a dead shine. He straightened, twisted his wrist, the empty flask popping once. Just then noise was all he owned. Noise proved he still existed, still got heard, still had it in him to make someone move there. Feet on the boards. The breeze switched and brought sage from up the street, slid under the porch, touched the sweat on Harlan's nape, and made him shiver. The boy glanced up for half a beat, eyes landing on the crust. A small motion flicked in his right fingers, like a swimmer reaching up to break the surface. But the boards were cold, and the black boot shadow sealed the well. A hay wagon rattled past, bales rocking, the dry sweet of cut stalks forced into the air. The driver clicked his tongue, steered around a rut, didn't look over. On the porch roof, a string that held someone's bell shook loose. The bell rolled to Harlan's boot and stopped, speaking one thin, empty note. Almost at once, farther off, a door hinge complained like a hand had found it. Harlan's mouth twitched, not a smile. A weathered line cut by sun and whiskey. He slid his shoulder against the post and left a dark smear. His shadow reached to the little trail of flour May had dropped and smudged half of it out, like erasing half a sentence. The boy still made no sound. In a hard way, that silence was louder than hobnails on plank. Harlan lifted his toe again. Not a kick, only a threat. It was enough to turn a few heads and then turn them away for good. Someone tried to light a cigarette and couldn't keep the match steady. A silver hair fell off a hat brim, flashed, and was gone. The street held one long, nameless note. At the porch edge the crust lay still, half dusted, half keeping the last gloss of its skin. The boy's prints stamped the boards. Rag oval skewed, next to them a deep, certain mark from a steel toe, loud, heavy, beyond explanation. Everything seemed to wait on the next thing, not fast, not noisy, just the thing that had to happen. The wind paused like it meant to witness. And then, somewhere on another step, a board spoke, soft, the sound of weight set on old wood, getting ready to come down. Part 4. Stepping into the street. The old board spoke again under someone's weight. Coulter Briggs shaped himself out of the porch's own shadow, wide brim hat pulled low, coat the color of earth, boots filmed with the season's yellow dust. He didn't hurry. First step to the dry spot, second into a spread of dew. The plank under his heel gave a fine little note and fell into the street's general hush. He walked straight, eyes on the one line ahead, the way you lead a high-strung horse that needs calm. His shoulder turned just enough to shelter the boy's face from the sun. The smell of oiled tack floated from some yard, threaded with May's oven crack of bread. The crust lay by a thin puddle, one side powdered. Coulter bent, lifted it with 2 fingers, dusted it clean, and turned the brown side up, as if returning a small thing its dignity. His hands were big, but the motion was light, like raising a word you didn't want anyone to overhear. He set the crust in Jem's hand, which shook a little. He didn't press it there, didn't snatch away, just left it until the thin fingers closed on their own. At the same time, his other hand found the boy's elbow and brought him up. The kid's breath rasped, his back curled as if to hide the hurt inside his shirt. The shirt hem brushed the back of Coulter's hand, cold as riverbank in winter. No questions, no soothing. Harlan stood close, steel toes wet at the tips. He cocked his chin. The empty flask tapped his thigh. Sour old liquor wrapped him like burnt kitchen smoke. His eyes were blooded, not with drink anymore, but with a long, losing run. The street leaned toward silence, as if folks were holding still to keep the cup from sloshing. Coulter slid Jem a half-step behind him and took the place between, his back becoming a new porch post. The big frame barely moved, only his chest lifting once. The hat brim shaded all the way to Harlan's steel toes. A fat, blackened watch chain showed at his vest edge. Quiet proof the man still honored hours, even if he used time only to name light and dark. Harlan tilted and bumped the post. A dry toke climbed the wood. His mouth hitched like it meant to spit a dirty word. The word never got born. Coulter raised his chin a fraction, tucked a shoulder, opened and closed his right hand. The motion of a man used to hammers, not knives. No taunt, no warning. The fist traveled the shortest road between two men. The sound wasn't loud, just meat finding bone, clean, dry, then the heavy noise of a body losing its set. Harlan lurched, grabbing for the post, smearing a dirty slide down the grain and sat hard. The tin flask rolled to the stair edge, clacked twice, and died. He covered his cheek a moment, eyes watering from shock more than shame. A dew bead clung to the steel toe, trembled, and fell. No cheer, no hands clapping. A woman at the general store let her twine swing in the breeze and forgot to knot it. The bootblack glanced up once and dropped his gaze back to the leather like he'd caught his reflection. Across the way, May Lark had just turned a tray. She stopped mid-motion at the thud, set it down, and let her thumb test a crack in a crust, as if to check for snap. Her eyes went to the porch, touched the boy's hand where the bread had returned. Then she turned away and opened the oven, letting heat pour farther into the street. Farther off, Sheriff Dunn rode by slow. The dull badge on his chest picked one point of light. He didn't haul on the reins, didn't jerk a strap, didn't shout a name. He cut Coulter one look long enough to mark who was standing upright, then touched his heels to move on. The red dust rose and fell behind the horse, like no one had passed. Coulter didn't spare Harlan another glance. He turned to the boy and brushed at the grit on his shoulder, a motion that meant little and somehow enough to tell a person he wasn't an obstacle. Jem clung to the crust like it was a curfew pass. His eyes flicked across the triangle of sun at the edge of Coulter's hat, stopped on the hatband where a thin scratch, hair fine, ran the leather. He breathed out without sound. Harlan clawed his way up. He spat on the part of the floor nobody stood on, worked half his word and swallowed it. The drunk in him guttered like wet coal. He swung away and snatched up the empty flask, gripping it like a last excuse to keep from seeing his own bare hands. His steel toes knocked one short, hard beat on the stair, and then the sound thinned, falling into wind and the squeal of a brake somewhere about to roll. The street went back to its chores like a herd after the lead cow shatters a dust devil. May pulled the door in to keep the flour from flying. The smell of bread deepened. The bootblack switched to another pair and worked with quick, even strokes. A different kid ran by, tripped a step, laughed from embarrassment, and forgot someone had just fallen. Nothing looked changed, and yet it was. A man had stepped into the street, and a crust had gone back to its rightful hand. Coulter opened his palm on Jem's back and gave a small push, the way you send a colt through a narrow gate. He didn't lift the boy. Some bodies have to stand on their own spine to remember it's there. Jem dipped his head the smallest bit, like a finger had found the right string inside him. They left the porch and crossed the dark red street, leaving behind the saloon's flat laughter and the liquor tang ground into old wood like a permanent stain. A fresher wind shouldered through, carrying pine and a faint smear of salve from the direction of the clinic, a signal anyone in town would know. Coulter didn't look that way, but his feet chose it. Their shadows laid 2 pencil lines across the road, one long, one short, running side by side. Back on the porch, a new dark slant marked the post, where a man had leaned to make himself bigger. The wind would dry it. The wood would forget. The crust in the boy's hand would not. They passed May's door. She didn't call out, only slid the tray deeper so the heat wouldn't spill to the street, saving a little warmth for when they came back. Coulter paused half a breath to square his hatband and went on. Ahead waited a door, a stove, a table that had held more than a few bleeding arms. Behind them the town gathered its noise again, sifted into the yellow dust settling close to the ground. Between those sounds there were no words, only the plain truth of footsteps taking the right direction. Part 5. The stove and the smell of salve. The sagging wooden door swung wide, and the little brass bell on the frame gave a thin chime. Doc Pruitt's clinic was warm like the inside of a living tree. An iron stove glowed in the corner, the flue breathing steady, heat mixed with camphor, pine pitch, and lye soap. On the shelf, brown glass bottles stood in ranks, each neck tied with a handwritten tag, salve, chest pains, ugh. A sun-planed table waited there, its edges worn down like the banks of a creek. Jem stalled half a step at the threshold, blinking when the sudden heat slapped his face. His whole body went stiff, the way a small animal goes at first sight of fire. Coulter set his big palm in the middle of the boy's back and gave a short push. Not hard, not hurrying. Jem came along, still clutching the heel of bread in a rag, his thumb hooked into the dry brown crust. Doc didn't say, "Come in, son," or "Let's have a look." He flipped the towel on his shoulder, washed his hands in an enamel basin, and dried them on a clean square of folded cloth. His hands were large, nails cut close, chalk dust packed along a few nail beds. He nodded toward the folding cot by the stove, its sun-aired blanket holding the faint smell of hay. Coulter dipped his head, slid one arm under Jem, didn't scoop him whole, just eased that small weight across his ribs so the boy could settle his own weight against a chest, like setting an old fiddle back where it fits. A small pair of shears split Jem's shirt along the seam, showing blue-green bruises, the ribs lifting shallow with each breath. Doc laid a warm palm across the small back, listened with his hand, then pressed very lightly along the ribs. Jem's mouth clamped, no sound, only the air stopping short inside his chest. Doc let out a long breath, as if emptying words he wasn't going to use. He dipped a strip of bandage through a saucer of amber salve, pressed off the extra, and wound it around the boy's chest, snug enough to make each breath slow itself down. Jem's other hand never let go of the bread. Even as the bandage crossed, he edged his wrist, so the crust kept clear of the cloth, as if afraid it would be taken for good. Doc angled his head and sent a quick look at Coulter. Coulter didn't explain. He set his hat on the table edge, the crown kissing an old scratch so it would stand still. The stove ticked and snapped. Pine pitch in the salve opened the nose the way a barn door opens at first light. Doc made one more turn, tied the knot around back so the breastbone wouldn't feel it. He ladled broth from a little pot hanging off the stove hook, blew until the boil left it, and held it out. Jem looked at the spoon, then at the bread, then at Doc's hand. He didn't reach. Coulter took the spoon, held it while the steam ran off, then propped the boy a touch higher with a tight roll of blanket. This time, Jem sipped. A short swallow, his throat sagged to welcome the warmth. His eyes filled in one quick wet shine that didn't fall. For the last pass, Doc slid a thin stick between Jem's teeth, so the pain had somewhere to go. After he eased it out and studied the small bite marks pressed in the edge, he rubbed his thumb over them to smooth the grain. He drew the blanket up over the boy's belly, leaving the shoes outside, so the chill of the boards could remind him he was ready to go if he had to. At the ankles, the rag ties had carved neat lines. The skin was scraped in a thin seam. Doc dabbed with warm water, careful not to touch the knots. Coulter worked the rear concho loose from the saddle strap he'd brought, levering a dull knife because the rivet had aged. When the silver disc came free, the leather gave a low ruck like a string of memory parting. He set the concho on the table, not shoved up, not perched, just weighted enough to stay. Old silver threw a flat ring of light on the wood. Doc glanced down. His jaw moved a fraction, close to a nod. He didn't count it, didn't pass it back. In this town, money was often a reminder. This table had kept more than a few silver shadows like that, each a story no one needed to tell. Jem held the bread with both hands. As the broth warmed his chest, his fingers eased enough that the crust quit rasping in his palms. Chicken simmered long in the pot. Onions sweated in fat. A touch of black pepper rode the steam. He took that smell in like a man puts his nose to an old coat after a day of rain. The stove sighed, and the flame changed body to a deeper orange. Shadows on the wall jumped once and stood still. Doc climbed onto his high stool and dipped a pen, writing in his ledger. Date, hour, rib cracks, 3 sites. Binding. His hand was neat, upright, leaning a little. He drew a short line at the bottom to lock it. He didn't ask a name. Some names aren't ready to be called. He slid a drawer, set out a peppermint wrapped in yellowed parchment, laid it by a tin cup that still kept a rim of broth fat. Jem looked and didn't take it. He tilted his head, let the mint thread his nose, and went back to keeping his breath even under the bandage. Coulter stood with one shoulder to the stove, one arm crossed, the other hand under his chin. He counted, without numbers, the times the flame lifted as if listening for the room's heartbeat. Sweat stood at his temple. He didn't wipe it. The watch chain hung from his vest, drifting with his breath. On its end, a small silver dog, edges worn smooth by years of a hand worrying it. Coulter lifted and let it drop so it tapped the metal once, thin as a spoon on a cup. Outside the little window, the sky went from young blue to chalky white. A hay wagon rolled past trailing dust. Sun caught the grains like startle flecks of fish in water. Hooves came near, then receded, then were gone. Inside, only the stove and the soft whisper of bandage as Jem drew a longer breath. He hitched the blanket up one finger's width and watched the needle hole of light in a ceiling crack. Doc pressed his palm to the wrap one last time and checked the knot. He tipped a nod at Coulter, enough to say, "That'll do." Coulter answered with a slow blink. He lifted a tin mug from the stove shelf, poured more broth and set it within reach of the child. No words fell. Warmth carried the rest. In a while Jem dozed, his body curled into the shape of a question. The bread still rested between his hands, but the fingers weren't white anymore. His shoes stayed on, toes pointing toward the door, worried but polite. Doc hauled the blanket higher, pinched the stove door to lower the fire, tidied the cloth and table, and eased out to the porch, leaving Coulter alone by the sleeping cot. Coulter looked at the clean white wrap holding a small chest and turned to the table. He pried a second concho out of the saddle strap, rolled it until a narrow band of light ran across its face. He didn't set it down. He slid it into his pocket with the watch chain. The balance of the morning's price would be paid in work, mending Doc's fence, throwing a tarp over his woodpile, replacing a cracked window pane. The kind of debts men settle here. Jem shifted faintly, his breathing snagging on the binding like a beginner trying to keep the left hand slow to match the right. Coulter put his hand out and didn't touch, held it in the air above the boy's shoulder, the way you keep a skittish colt from jumping. In the space between his palm and that small body there was the faint smell of coffee gone cool from this morning's porch, a scent no one else would notice. In there, between salve and fire, lay a small warm patch where a thin faith could stand a while, waiting to be called by its name. Part 6. The first night at the ranch. By the time the wagon shouldered through the coarse grass, the sun had broken into long, thin shards across the ridges. The south ridge gate opened to a shove. The old hinges cleared their throat in the dust. The yard was quiet, haystacks under a tarp, the water trough mossed in one corner, a line strung along the wall with sun-bleached towels. The gray horse pushed its head from the stall, blew a white breath, and pricked its ears at the squeal of a wheel. Coulter set Jem down so the boy could find his own way to lean against that chest, no squeeze. The small heels hit dirt, slid a little in, sand, then held. They crossed the low sill. The cabin took them the way a hollow takes wind. Lamp trimmed and waiting, kindling stacked. The dry pine scent of many seasons. Coulter teased the coals in the fireplace and laid on a few splits. Flame climbed and in a blink blushed the whole room. The kitchen corner held iron, skillet, pot, a chipped ladle. Coulter filled the kettle and set it on the grate. He brought down 2 tin cups, the chipped one to the right, as always. The first tap of steam beat the lid. That small sound was familiar enough to put a man to sleep. He measured the coffee, shook it into the kettle, lowered the fire. The smell rose, twining with pine and road dust in their coats. He poured 2 cups, his own to the brim, the second a halfway, left by the stove. Handle turned outward, the stitched leather round the rim still shiny with hand grease. He nudged that cup into the warm edge of the firelight, the way a man sets a coat over someone's shoulders as they cross a windy step. Jem stood by the table, both hands on the edge to keep his balance. The bandage had tired his face, but his eyes were still bright. Coulter pulled a wool blanket from the chest, spread it over his own long bench, then stacked pillows by the stove, the boy's bed. He didn't say, "Lie down." He only slid a small stool closer so the warm reached all the way to the boy's feet. The jackknife slid home in its sheath. Coulter lifted the noon's pot of beans, skimmed the fat, splashed a little water, and set it back to heat. Onion caught and sweetened. An honest smell rose. He set a tin bowl before Jem and a piece of maize crackle-skinned bread bought late in the day. The boy held the spoon in both hands and sipped slow. Each mouthful traveled the bandage and the breathing eased back. A streak of broth mapped the back of his dirty hand. He stopped, wiped it with his wrist, and went on. Coulter ate standing, hip to the table, eyes in the fire more than in the bowl. When he was done, he fed the stove, pinched the door to let the flame settle, and inched the second cup closer to the grate. Coffee smoke wound itself into the pine burn, a single thread rounding the ceiling, slow as someone sounding out a long sentence. Night lifted the yard up closer. Outside, wind slid through sage and brought dry herb into the cracks. Ice popped along the trough. The sash cord hummed once and stilled. It was like a band that knew exactly when to hush, so you could hear a house breathe. Jem finished and set the bowl down with both hands. He fumbled the knot at his ankle rags, thought better of it, tied them back. His eyes flicked to the door's wooden bar. Coulter walked over and turned the latch. The crossbar dropped into its groove with a single thunk. He didn't look at Jem, but he kept his hand on the bar one beat longer, writing a soft period on the wall. Jem pulled the blanket up to his chest and lay near the stove. His shoes still on, the laces tucked under so they wouldn't snag. He faced the door, listening to the wind change channels. Each time the stove snapped, he woke half an inch, and shut again. Coulter doused the big lamp and left a small one on the stove crown, enough light to find the cup still sending steam. He stretched on the long bench, knees bent, his coat for a cover. His right hand rested over the watch chain pocket as if holding a thought still. Toward midnight, the wind shifted hard. Windows moaned. The roof boards whispered. A coyote called far off. The gust cut it to little bits that fell in the yard. Jem sat up halfway and looked at the bar. It was there. He breathed out through his nose, lay back, but kept his hand on the floorboard edge the way you keep fingers on a skiff's gunwale. After a while, he got up, padded to the door, felt the bar, and slipped back without a sound. Coulter didn't say sleep. He only reached down from the bench and flicked another chip into the fire so the burning covered the boy's broken rhythm. He sat up, turned the second cup quarter, pushed it into the bright ring. He didn't drink it. He let its warmth travel across the table, through the room, to where two small knees lay under the blanket. Deeper into night, sage thickened the air. The porch boards clicked as the heat changed. From the stall, the horse blew once, long and quieted. Jem sank into a thin sleep. Dreaming or not, he hitched a finger closer to the stove. The shoes stayed on, but the heels lay easy against the blanket, not bunched like before. Coulter let his head fall back, eyes half open. On the scarred rim of the second cup, the fire struck a tiny phosphor on the table, winking and fading with the draft, as if sending a signal no one had answered yet. In the quiet, he could hear two breaths, one long, one short, match for a few cycles, drift apart, and find each other again. He set his palm flat to the wood and kept the cup steady, as if to keep a little invisible flame from being blown out. Toward dawn, the cold drew tight. The embers shrank to a yolk. Coulter hauled himself up, smoothed the blanket over Jem, let his hand hover a beat at the bandage to take its heat. His own heart was slower than other nights. Like the house had gained just enough weight that the wind couldn't budge it. He went back to the bench, pulled his coat up, and closed his eyes. On the grate, the second cup was still warm. No one had drunk it, but it wasn't alone anymore. It sat where someone would wait with it until it cooled, and maybe come morning it would be filled to the top from the start. Part 7. Small chores that teach how to stay. Morning curled itself over the pasture. Dew beaded white on the fence wire, heavy enough to fall when someone passed. Coulter crossed the yard with an axe, the pine from last night still on his coat. He eased the barn door and let Jem follow, the boy's small hand resting on the edge, the way you test if wood belongs to you yet. The gray horse shook its mane. The night's sweat had dried to a thin salt on its neck. Coulter passed the straw brush to Jem. He held it a little awkward, tried one stroke, the bristles rasping lightly over hide. The horse tipped its head, eyes pinched, enduring. By the third stroke it let go and blew a warm stream from its nose. Outside, the trough had a skin of ice over half its face. Coulter leaned on the haft of the wooden mallet, cracked the ice into spiderwebs. Chips jumped and clung in Jem's hair like fish scales. He brushed them off with the back of his hand and dipped a tin pail, laying the rim against the lip of the trough to make a little run where water could pour slow. The motion was slow, sure, without jerks. Coulter watched a beat and gave a nod. Almost no one would catch. by the woodpile under the tarp. The tie rope was frayed like the long tendons on an old hand. Jem teased the knot, pulled the tarp back, and the smell of pitch and sawdust rose. The same smell as the clinic yesterday. He stacked kindling by the kitchen door in rows, the wood ends all pointing one way like calves at evening. Each piece went down with a low, solid clonk, no stumbles. Coulter turned one stick so the grain lay with the others, then stepped back and let Jem finish on his own. Sun climbed the ridge. Gold dust and cattle breath drifted into the yard and settled on Coat's shoulders. Coulter set 2 coffee cups on the porch step, his steamed plainly. The second he placed at the edge of sun so it would warm without scalding. Jem tapped the rim with a fingertip and jerked back from the heat. Then he sat on the lower step, eyes tracking a line of ants toting last night's crumbs. One arched its back too much, dropped its prize, went back, fetched it, and carried on. He watched for a long while as if learning the stubbornness of a small thing. Time to tie the horse out. Coulter ran the lead rope through Jem's hands. The boy wrapped it around the post the way he'd seen that morning. One turn, a half hitch, the tail toward himself. The rope took a set. The post didn't wobble. Coulter tested with a light tug. No slip. He pressed a knuckle to the boy's shoulder, a touch that meant good. No words. Dry wind at noon. Inside, Coulter spread an oilcloth on the table and opened May's rim-wrapped loaf. The brown crust shone like oiled hide. When he broke it, the shell gave a small crack and steam from the sourdough lifted. He slid the thicker half into Jem's bowl and kept the rest. The boy rubbed his spoon over the bread's face to test its softness, then tore off thin lengths and dipped them into the bean fat clinging at the pot's bottom. Flour from the crust dusted his lip. He licked it off, unhurried. On the sill, 2 tin cups kissed once when a draft came through, a kind of agreement that didn't require saying. Afterward, Coulter brought out an old saddle with a torn edge and handed Jem a leather needle and waxed thread. He fed the line, left hand holding, right hand pulling, the needle punching through with a dry little chup, like a bean falling on a board. The stitches wandered, the thread twisted now and then. Coulter waited and, when needed, blocked the needle with his thumb to set the next pass into the groove. The rip closed into a fishbone seam, not pretty, but sound. Sweat pricked Jem's upper lip. He swiped it with his wrist and bent again. In the yard corner, the chickens shuffled the dirt, letting out lazy clucks to fill the air. By evening, the porch shadow stretched like a blanket pulled over the yard. Coulter checked the stall latch and lifted the hinge a touch to stop its squeal. Jem hauled a bucket to wash. The water punched his bones cold, and he sucked air through his teeth, then set the pail down on the same wet mark as before. In the kitchen, the bean pot went back to the fire, a little water, a pinch of salt. Onion came on again like a sentence you've learned by heart and feel easy every time. After supper, Coulter didn't feed more wood. He slid the stove door nearly shut and let the fire lie small and red. He turned the second cup deeper toward the stove mouth. Steam lifted a lock of Jem's black hair off his brow. The boy swept it behind his ear, a move from someone who has lived in a windy house. He dug a coin from his pocket and fitted it into a crack in the tabletop, nudging it to the center like a tiny wedge to keep loose things from sliding away. Before bed, Jem looked down at his shoes. The rag lace was tied in a single knot on the inside of his ankle, neat as a promise he could go quick. He touched it, let go, touched it again. Coulter sat on the porch, wetting the axe on an oilstone. The even scrape sounded like breathing. No one called to anyone. No one told anyone what to do. The stove's fire dropped another notch. The gold dust outside fell into the dark. Jem pulled the wool blanket to the bench and sat. He bent, found the lace end. The knot was stiff with salt and dirt. He worked it, The knot gave half a turn. He stopped and looked at the door bar. It was still set. He bent again, separated the strands, and drew the lace through the eyelets, like a small snake backing into its hole. The left shoe came first. He set it square by the stove, toes in. He flexed his toes. The skin on his soles burned like dry grass. The right followed, laid tight to the left, the tips of fingers' width from the board edge, enough to keep from kicking them in the morning. Coulter kept on with the stone, but through the doorway he saw the pair of shoes exactly where he put his on cold nights. He let the stone fall into his palm, wiped the blade with a rag, stood and dropped the bar again. Not needed, but done. Jem pulled the blanket up, turned his back to the stove, and let his bare feet find the warm patch on the ticking. He listened to the stove tick, the brief clatter of hens before they settled, the saddle creak from the corner like a tired animal breathing out. Each sound was a thin string tying him to the room. Near midnight the wind nosed under the eaves. A coyote sang farther off than the night before, passing, not stopping. Jem didn't sit up. He slid his hand down the bedside to feel the floor. Warmer than at first. On the table, the second cup still breathed. Coulter snuffed the big lamp. The stove's red eye and a slim silver glint at the cup's rim were enough. He lay on the long bench, coat across his chest, and breathed even. Before sleep took him, Jem drew his legs in once and let them stretch. Bare feet touched the warm dust clinging to the old rug, a small feeling and rare. He pulled the blanket to his throat and left a slip of cold air to remind his lungs of the outside. In the next room the wind ran a window and left. In that leaving, Jem stayed. His shoes lay by the stove waiting on morning. His faith lay in the set bar, the second cup put in its place, the axe newly honed. Quiet things teaching him how to be still inside a house. Part 8. A shadow in the empty tent. Town ended in a strip of hard ground tufted with sage, each bush like a clenched green fist. There a canvas tent slumped on two bent poles. The guy lines had rotted, the knots bulged like veins. Evening wind flipped the hem and showed ribs thrown together from old powder crate boards. On one plank, half the word powder still clung. Harlan Cobb shoved the flap aside and ducked in. The space had no sound in it. Earth floor crusted with salts, a caved camp cot, a surplus blanket slicked with oil stains, steel-toed boots propped by a stake like two dead fish. In the corner, a wooden crate served as a table, its top stamped with two coffee rings, one dark, one faint. The faint was almost gone, like a footprint polished off by wind. On the dark ring, a dented tin cup sat upright, the inside of it black as a well. He dug out his flask. The hide was soft, the bottom thin, empty. He shook it, tipped it. One dark drop crawled over the lip and smeared a dirty trail across the back of his hand. He half sniffed and wiped it off on his sleeve. Beside the flask lay a folded paper, edges dog-eared, black ink washed, the Dry Fork brand stamped up top, a line of clipped words beneath. Season's done, no more hands. In the corner, sweat had bloomed a ragged lake. He reached for the wood box, empty, only a handful of dirty straw and some punky sticks. He struck matches from a damp box. The head screeched like teeth on bone. A spark caught and died, caught and went out. The fourth time, flame bit the straw, crawled to the rotten sticks, breathed 3 breaths, and fell. Sour blue smoke pooled under the canvas and burned his eyes. He patted at it, hoping to warm something, water or memory, and only stirred the smells of wet earth, old liquor, and sweat. A dull knife lay near the edge. He picked it up and carved at a heel of jerky, hard as stone, shaving a thin chip. He put it to his mouth. His teeth clicked. It melted into spit as slow as bad news crossing ranch lines from one crew to the next. He chewed, swallowed, and His throat asked for something else he didn't have. Outside, a coyote threw a long call that slid into threads in the wind and poked under the canvas to look around and leave. He tightened his belt one more hole to quiet his belly. He set his elbows on the crate and felt the cool of the coffee ring through his forearm. His forefinger worked the rim without thinking, finding a boundary he knew. 2 rings, one drunk, one not. The feint was almost gone. If you didn't lay a finger on it, you'd never remember it. He let his hand fall, and it touched the cup. He picked it up, turned it over, set it down again. The kind of useless move you do so many years it becomes a habit. A cheap harmonica bulged his shirt pocket. Harlan slid it out and put it to his mouth. The reeds were hoarse. One tongue snapped. The sound came like an old horse breathing. He tried again. Same. He put it away, and his hand went stiff. That stiffness wasn't cold. It climbed from weariness, salted with a little shame and a little fear. Fear that tomorrow would be the same as today. From a corner, a pair of rotten latigo straps dropped, their brass keepers black as coal. Harlan rolled a keeper in his fingers and remembered saddle leather hot on his thighs when a horse ran in the right rhythm. He remembered the clean sweat of work that straightens a man's back. Those things left him without ceremony, the way a herd slips through a boundary into the next range on a fog night. What stayed was the steel toe that had once been useful for setting posts and now knew how to knock on something softer, just to hear a noise. Lights came up in town. A bar of music floated and cut. Wind brought the smell of yeast and gave it back. From Main Street, maize bread drifted a thin line, enough to turn his stomach over. He hitched the blanket over his shoulders, but it ran short and left his knees bare. He stretched, and his knee found the rip at the cot edge. The metal scraped his skin. A stray dog nosed at the tent mouth, hunting a scrap. Harlan twitched the steel toe. The dog flinched back. He could have kicked. He raised his foot and set it down. The dog sniffed the air and went. In that small second, there was no sound. He pulled the crate closer and set the tin cup into the dark ring, like fitting it to its mark. He looked at it a long time, and his lids went heavy. Over at Coulter's, a second cup sat by the stove and waited for someone. Here, the only cup on a cold table waited for. Oh! Nothing. He reached under the cot for a leather pouch and drew out 2 bent nickels, a rusty nail, a shirt button from some forgotten season. Little things, but they knocked together into a sound. The sound a man makes when he still has something to carry, though nobody wants it. A shiver ran his spine. He pulled his hat down over his eyes and listened to the tent complain in the wind. A thumb-sized hole at the hem let a star in, cold. He turned his face from it and lay on his side. His jaw ached from jerky. His lips had split. Blood crept as slow as oil on a winter day. The tin cup beside his hand stayed empty, mouth up like a sky mortar folks tip their heads to in a drought. He shut his eyes. From somewhere, a memory snagged up like a nailhead catching the rag. A far dawn, 2 cups steaming on a packing crate, another hand setting sugar down. No one left to swear to it now. The memory sank at once like a rock into a dry well with no plop. Harlan pulled the blanket to his chest and cinched his belt one more hole. Outside, wind dragged sage past the tent mouth and left a little earth inside for chinking. In the dark, the tin cup tilted a hair and kissed the dark ring with a very small king. No one heard. Only emptiness heard itself and went to sleep. Not deep. Just enough to wake into morning and still know the road back to town. Part 9. The Afternoon Porch, Counterpoint. Afternoon slanted down, gold dust hanging like small fish swimming slow in the light. Main Street softened a notch. The hammer in the smithy fell less often. Heavy wheels hissed through board gaps with a gentler scrape. May Lark cracked her door so the heat wouldn't pour straight into the street. The scent of split crust, sour starter, and burnt sugar spread thin as a fragrant blanket. On the porch opposite, Coulter Briggs leaned to the rough rail, his left hand easy on a neatly coiled rein. The brim shaded his cheekbone, keeping the glare off his eyes. Farther off, Sheriff Dunn rode a light bay at the pace of a man counting sand through an hourglass. He stopped in the patch of tree shade, turned his wrist to slacken the rein, and let the horse mouth the bit a while. The town kept that half-awake, half-dreaming rhythm of late day. Not hurrying, not still. Harlan Cobb stepped out at the saloon corner. No plume of drink ahead of him now. He'd brushed the blunt dust from his coat, hair pressed down. The empty tin wasn't knocking his hip. He walked with steel toes set down lighter than the morning they remembered. Still clack and thud, but measured. On each plank his shadow stretched and drew in again, like a rope with someone holding the far end. He stopped beneath the porch. The board where he stood had spooned under the weight of boots. For years, the wind jostled the bakery May Lark sign once, then yielded. Coulter tipped away from the post by an inch and stood straight. His palm stayed on the rein. The pulse under his skin was even. Inside, May paused a heartbeat when the two shadows touched, then slid her pan deeper in so the warm could rise at its own pace. Nobody spoke. The counterpoint stood itself in the old frame. The same post, the same corner step, the scratch in the grain from the last time steel rubbed wood. The bread wasn't on the ground today. It rode in May's willow basket at her shoulder. A fresh break still breathed. The crust scored with one fine line like a saddle seam newly stitched. Coulter let the rein fall, slid his right hand into his pocket, and brought out a silver dollar. Not new, its rim worn round by many hands. The face on it faded by half. He didn't flip it or hold it out. He set it on the step exactly where Harlan stood. Metal kissed wood with a clean, final sound, and went silent, like a period written in iron. Harlan looked at the coin. Sunlight crept across it until a thin halo rose like oil on water. He didn't bend at once. He lifted his gaze under the brim of Coulter's hat and saw the street. The bootblack switching brushes, an old fellow hauling salt wiping his brow on his sleeve, May wiping a tabletop edge with a wet cloth. Sheriff Dunn eased his horse half a step, close enough to hear metal if it touched wood again. Harlan bent, his back folded to an angle as his hand reached the dollar. His thumb was cracked and rough, nail edges stained with lampblack. The coin was cool. He held it longer than needed, the measure of a word a man chooses not to say. At the corner of his eye, a small tremor came and went. Not whiskey, but the swallowing of a humiliation that had been talking in his throat for a long time. He slid the coin into his breast pocket. His fingers brushed the mouth organ there and came away. On the porch, Coulter moved his hand from the rail and pressed his palm flat to the board, feeling the grain the wind had scoured. He didn't watch Harlan pocket the coin. He studied the tiny, fresh chip on the step, new since the morning when steel toe had grazed past. He laid a fingertip to it, like checking a seam you've just stitched. Not blame, not pardon, just recognition. Harlan breathed out through his nose, the metal taste in it fainter than most days. He drew a half step back from the porch edge. His shoulder didn't touch the post. For a blink of sun, light crossed his face and showed the stiff stubble on his lip and a thin scar at the cheekbone, things men get from too much outside. He raised his hat a hand's width, not a greeting, just to let wind cool his forehead, then put it back. He turned away, steel toes no longer pointed at anything that needed kicking. His shadow unhitched from the porch, thinned, and slipped into the gold. Sheriff Dunn touched his heels. The pale bay shifted a half stride and shone. The sheriff nodded once, no label on it, like a man signing something he's read. May pushed her door wider and slid a new loaf on the rack. The crust answered with its small applause. Somebody's child ran by, the ribbon in her hair bobbing like a bell without sound. Coulter lifted his hand from the rail. He drew a cloth from his pocket and rubbed a new film of dust from the silver conchos on the rain, returning them to their usual muted shine. On the step, a faint circle marked where the dollar lay, a wet ring that would dry when the sun moved, but in the mind of the man on the porch it would last longer, paid. The debt for a ruined loaf had been closed with a coin and a man standing straight. The rest, the street would settle by itself. Jim wasn't on the porch that afternoon. Out at the ranch, the second cup was likely cooling by half a mark on the grate, waiting on small hands to top it with hot water so it wouldn't go to waste. The counterpoint was complete. On one porch, a man set something down, $1. By one stove, someone kept something warm, a cup kept for someone. Between the two ran the town's red road, its dust like flour sifted lightly over the boards, making everything look as if patience had just been sprinkled there. Harlan reached the edge of town where the light went quick. He stopped at the cheap store window and saw a not tall man with a tilted shoulder and shadowed eyes. He touched his breast pocket. The dollar was there, cold. For a blink he started back toward the saloon. His hand found the door, but the rot of old drink breathed out of the wood and brought with it a handful of thin, worn-out laughs older than he was. Harlan drew his hand back. He turned his back on the door and walked toward the slumped tent, where the wind could pass his face and leave no smell. A small move, and plain. On the porch, Coulter set his hat, lifted the rein from the rail, and stepped down. Gold dust rose at his heels and fell as fast as a decision long since made. In her doorway, May slid a loaf into a paper sack and left it on the edge of the counter for whoever might come by at just the right moment. The oven stayed hot. The town took a long breath. The sky went to brass. Everything sat where it belonged, changed and not, like how evening always finds the same porch, but never the same light. Part 10. A quiet night. Cracks open. Night dropped like a heavy blanket. The ranch yard lay flat, the South Ridge sign rope rasping a small beat on its nail. Inside, the fire had drawn down to a yoke. The second coffee cup stood on the grate, its chipped rim catching ember light like a flecked star clinging to tin. Coulter sat on the long bench back to the wall, one arm folded under the other, listening to the wood swell and ease. Jem lay close to the stove. His bandaged breathing was slower than the night before. The wind shifted. Sage no longer came in by the old path from the grass. It banked around the porch, slid through the rear window seam, and carried a different scent. Wet hide, iron, frozen mud. Something scraped the glass. No branch. A small silence broke in half, like a thin stream split by a rock. Coulter rose without a sound and reached for the rifle by the wall. He touched a finger to his mouth. His eyes met Jem's. The boy nodded once, rolled from the blanket, lifted the trap under the rug, and slipped down like a drop into a crack of stone. The lid settled, cool dirt and dry straw wrapped him. Below, he counted his breath by his own heart. 1, 2, stop, 1, 2. Upstairs, Coulter took 3 steps to the back door. A floorboard spoke a fine note and then agreed to be quiet. A shape crossed the window again, low, heavy. Breath filmed the pane and faded. He slid the inside bolt, leaned, left hand on the rifle stock, right hand nudging the side door open a hand's width. Wind shouldered in, carrying the smell of a horse pulled up. Somewhere leather creaked once and held. He dropped the muzzle toward dirt by the stoop. 1 shot. The crack was short and contained. Fire flashed the yard. powder smoke and pitch braided into one quick sting. Grit pecked the porch under the blast. The thing outside broke its nerve. Hooves pawed loose and ran. The bit chain scraped a ring, and a man's curse got swallowed by wind. Then distance, then nothing. The window went back to throwing the firelight. The glass stopped breathing. Coulter waited those few extra beats while the dark stitched up the rip. He closed the side door softly and set the bolt. His hand skimmed the wall to find the lamp hook. No need to light it. The stove turned and clicked like an old man rubbing his hands. Gun smoke pooled at the ceiling and thinned, leaving a coin taste on the tongue. He crossed the room, pulled the rug, and raised the trap. Cool earth rose. Jem looked up, eyes round from the dark. Coulter reached down. He didn't haul. He just kept the arm there so a smaller hand could find its climb. Warm from a living wrist ran up into his palm like a message of, "All right." Jem came up the rungs and paused on the last one to listen. Outside was quiet. He stood on the boards, the wrap lifting at his chest. The room returned to its native noises, a saddle breathing against the wall, a curtain giving one small shake, a nail in the corner, popping now and then like corn. Coulter racked the rifle on its pegs and wiped the chamber with an oiled rag, patient as a man rewriting the word restraint. Jem went slow to the stove. One hand hugged his ribs, then traded, and held the kettle to take its heat. He tipped it and poured the second cup halfway. The black stream crossed the chip and drew a brown ring along the lip, like test stitches on coarse cloth. Steam clouded the stove glass and wrote another layer of warmth over air that had just been cut. He slid the cup toward Coulter. No shove, just one quiet push, and let the tin find its old place on the table, the spot that had sat alone every morning and now had someone across from it. Coulter watched the handle turn to his hand, watched fire roll crawl the tin's back, and sat. He didn't lift the cup at once. He set his hand around it and drew the heat, like cupping a fledgling that tumbled from a nest. Jem stood opposite, running his forefinger along the tabletop where he'd wedged a coin in the crack the other day. Dust stuck to his skin, a little wet with warmth. He looked up and, through the stove's halo, saw a face lit on one side and shadowed on the other. The night that had split was already knitting here with quiet things. He moved his mouth. The sound wasn't big, no louder than a coal settling. One word crossed the space between them like a nail driven true into the grain. Short, round, warm. Coulter heard it. He didn't answer with words. His hand tightened a half joint more around the cup. Bone rose and faded under the skin. At his eye's edge, a new crease appeared, not from strain. Jem tugged the small chair in, sat tilted so the bandage wouldn't bite. He put his palm on the table so his own skin lay over the rough, telling himself this was a surface he could trust. The stove door murmured when a stick collapsed. From the stall, the horse cleared its nose and settled, as if it too had checked the fence. Outside, the wind slid back to the old direction and brought sage the known way. After a while, Coulter lifted the cup and blew. The steam cut a pale path through the room and rinsed what powder smell was left. He sipped. Warmth went down and came to rest where his chest had had an empty space. He set the cup back. Tin found wood with a small signal. Jem eyed the chip and turned the handle to the familiar angle, like mornings, then nudged the cup another half-inch to Coulter as if to say, "That's its place, and yours." Night opened outward. No more shadows past the glass. The house sat back on its spine, stove here, table there, chair there, rifle on the pegs, the second cup warm in the right hand. The earth smell hadn't quite left the hatch. On the table, a thin coffee ring was already fading to a faint band, a mark tomorrow would remember. Coulter checked the door bar and the tie, then came back and drew the blanket higher on Jem's shoulder by half a finger, leaving a little cold at the throat to remind the Lungs they were in the living world. When they doused the lamp, the stove ticked on like a clock. Outside, the gold dust slept. The sky darkened to where wind had no claws. In that hush, the crack in the night sealed over by coffee, by gun smoke already flown, and by one small warm word set in its right place. On the table, the second cup no longer cooled alone. It had someone to wait for and someone to drink with. Part 11. The dented rim stitched back. Dawn slipped through the cut of the hills like a thin blade, paring layers of fog from the grassland. On the porch, the 2 tin cups sat in their appointed places, one full, one half. The second still kept some heat from the night. Its chipped rim caught the sun and held a pin of light. Jem perched on the lower step, knees hugged, listening to cattle call one another out on the range. Coulter scattered mash for the hens, then stood a beat, looking down the red road toward town. The road lay smooth, as if last night had been only a stray wind passing through. Hoofbeats unhurried. Sheriff Dunn appeared at the edge of the yard, the bay breathing white. He took a wooden signboard from his saddle. Letters burned black. Trespassers prosecuted. No speech-making. Coulter swung the gate. The old post managed one creek and was done. The sheriff chose his spot on the fence, exactly where a man would stop before stepping into the yard, set the board, chalked it, and drove 2 nails. 3 even strokes of the hammer. The sound carried over the pasture and faded like sun off a steer's back. Jem stood beside him with a bag of nails. Each time the sheriff reached, the boy tipped a nail up into his palm. His own hand dusted silver. A very small nod went back and forth between the grown man and the child. The sheriff drew a 3rd nail, tapped it home for good measure, then stepped back half a pace and sighted along the rail. He felt the board's edge wiped the last of the dust from it and set the hammer on the fence. The bay cocked its head and nibbled the rain, as it did every morning. No words wasted. Dunn touched 2 fingers to his brim, his glance sliding to the nick in the tin cup on the porch. He saw it and didn't ask. Coulter answered with the faintest shift of his hatband. The sheriff mounted, turned the bay to the road. The horse walked on, and the new board lay quiet on the fence, black letters facing the open like a taciturn sentry. When the dust at the gate had settled, Coulter went back to the porch. He set the second cup on the table, flipped it, and checked the makeshift leather wrap he'd laced on in a hurry the other day. The leather had dried by many fires. Its edge was fraying, a few stitches had let go. He opened the leather box. Fresh rawhide laces, an awl needle shears, a punch, a tin of saddle grease. He cut a thin strip of leather and dropped it in a pan of water to soften. While it soaked, he tapered one end of the rawhide thong to a small arrow point. Jem set the nail bag down and crouched, chin on his knees, to watch. Coulter lifted the cup, measured the rim, found the chip. He used the punch to open a line of small, even holes around the rim, skirting the chip so it wouldn't tear. The awl's taps on tin rang short, ting-ting, like a bell practicing how to breathe. When the leather had gone soft, he squeezed the water out, stroked the grain straight in his palm, and laid it along the rim, placing the chip between 2 stitches. He threaded the rawhide and worked a mattress stitch, one outside, one inside, pulling just enough to make the leather clasp the tin. Each draw he greased the lace, the smell of saddle fat mixed with cold coffee and porchwood. Together they made the smell of a house. Jem leaned in and steadied the cup. His nails were smoke black. The bandage under his shirt bumped his ribs, but his breathing held even. Coulter finished the first round, pressed the leather flat with the needle's tip, then ran a second course to lap the stitches. The chip sank under the stitched band, still there, but no longer something to cut a lip. He tied off at the handle, tucked the knot to the inside, trimmed the end, and rubbed in more grease. The new strip took a soft shine in the sun, like a gentle ring of law set around a thing that had once been sharp. Coulter turned the cup in his hands, blew it dry, and upended it. The bottom showed the miles, coffee rings driven in, thin scratches ground by grit. He opened his jackknife, the blade thinned to silver by years of working saddlewood. He pricked 3 guide dots, 1 center, 2 to either side. Then he cut the letters, slow, sure, short strokes, deep, J, E, M. Each bite into the tin gave a fine rasp, not harsh. It sounded like wind through nail holes in a sheet of roofing. Jem stared at the 3 letters standing up. His finger hung in the air, not daring to land. Coulter rubbed a little stove ash into the cuts, so the black settled into the grooves, then brushed the rest away. The name lay dark against the dulled silver, his name in a place no one could take with a word. He set his fingertip on the dot between E and M. It trembled once, then stayed longer than needed, as if weighing the metal, or the new thing being set down. A breeze pushed across the porch. The fence board spoke very softly, reminding them the boundary had been turned into words. Coulter poured more coffee, set the mended cup toward Jem, and turned the handle to suit a small hand. The boy didn't drink at once. He cuffed the cup in both hands and let the warmth draw the ache from his knuckles. He rested the rim against the bandage at his chest for 1 second, then set the cup on the table, exactly a half-inch from the old scratch, the way it belonged. Coulter gathered the tools, wiped the grease from the awl, and put the laces away. He hefted the sheriff's hammer, tapped the fence nail heads once more, didn't need to, and did. The gray horse poked its head from the stall, listened to the single knock, and slid back, as if a calm order had been given. They carried the cups out to the porch. Sun tracked along the new stitching, warming the leather, loosening the grease to a faint gloss. Jem ran a forefinger down the line of stitches, counting without sound. When he reached the place of the old chip, he paused longer and moved on, the way a man walks over a hole that's been filled, not afraid, not forgetting. Coulter pulled a chair back half a stride from the table, leaving a space just right for a small person to slip in whenever he chose. Out on the fence, the board faced the open, its letter shadows lying on the blotched grass like ink. A kestrel lit on the post and fanned its wings in the sun, unbothered by text. The road into town wavered in noon heat. If anyone passed, the dust would lift and fall. But the 3 letters, J, E, M, would not. In the kitchen, the bean pot ticked and bubbled, throwing a beat under the quiet. Jem aligned his shoes on the sill, toes in, heels touching, 1 finger width from the board's edge, same as last night. He slipped his hand through the cup's new wrap and tested the lift. The weight was right. The leather gripped the rim and didn't bite a lip. He tipped the cup a breath and drew the coffee up through the stitch line, a new smell already familiar. Coulter stood at the porch edge and looked once more toward the sign. He popped his hat, dusted it, set it back. In his eyes the night had gone to ground behind the house and lay quiet near the stall, leaving room for a morning with a name. He went in and raised his own cup. Under that tin, the 3 letters still rested beneath a small hand. There was no need to say who it belonged to. The stitching said it. The ash in the grooves said it. The heat pooling in a small chest said it. The wind gentled. Far out, the herd drifted into the shape of a sea under their shadows. On the porch, both cups sent up steam. The red road kept the old hoofprints still, like a record written in dust. The fence sign didn't threaten anyone. It only stood and meant, knock when you come through. Inside, the dent had been stitched, still visible, but no longer tearing skin. And on the cup's bottom, a name had been set to the warmest place a boy could find in this country. Part 12. Sourdough and a First Name. Afternoon slid over the hills like a warm snake, leaving a thin corona of light along the new posted fence. Wind carried the smell of dried straw and pine pitch in a loop that came to rest on the porch and plucked the curtain. May lark arrived when the tree shadow touched the yard's edge. A small handcart, a glass jar wrapped in coarse cloth and tied with hemp twine. She didn't knock loud. 2 taps of knuckle on wood were enough for the people inside without alerting the neighbors. Coulter opened the door. She set the sourdough jar in his hands. Under the cloth, the mouth breathed softly like a small, living thing. She tucked in a wooden spoon, its handle darkened by years of pot stirring. Her eyes traveled the room, the fire banked, the table scrubbed, the tin cup with its leather seam lying by the edge. She gave the slightest nod, as if recording that something had been done right. When she turned to go, she left one thread-like sentence hanging in the air. "Don't let the fire go out." Then she was gone. The bread in her cart scented the yard a little way and dissolved into wind. In the kitchen, Coulter loosened the cloth. The starter fizzed with small bubbles like rain collected on a sage leaf. He fed it a little flour and warm water, stirring slow. The sour tang and the sweetness of new flour braided together with the clean crackle smell of crust not yet born. Jem watched the spoon make its rounds. He touched a fingertip to a bubble, set it on his tongue, and the tart woke his whole mouth. He winced and laughed with his eyes, not his voice. Coulter capped the jar and set it by the stove where the second cup often stood. Warmth seeped from brick into glass. The bubbles breathed more evenly. The surface rose a little. He marked a charcoal line on the jar to fix the starting level, a habit from measuring rain in a barrel. Outside, the sheriff's board knocked once when the wind turned, then kept its counsel. Evening drew off the window like a thin oil. In the room, small sounds took turns keeping time, flour flicking from a spoon's edge, a cuff brushing the table, resin answering the flame with tiny snaps. Coulter floured the board, slid the bowl of dough across, and nudged it to Jem. Small hands pressed, folded, pulled. Clumsy at first, paste built up into white gloves on his palms. Coulter set his big hand over the boys and showed the path. Fold, turn, rest. The dough's rhythm changed. Each fold smuggled a breath inside, the way you hide a sigh in a private place so later it rises as softness. They put the dough to sleep under a wet cloth. The jar by the stove swelled another finger width past the mark. Jem eyed the old black line and the lifted surface, learning in his way that time can fill things, not only take them. He propped a trivet near the fire, set the second cup on it, poured halfway, and let the heat find his wrist. Coffee and dough scented the room together into a kind of family smell he'd never had a name for. Dark came on tiptoe. Coulter lit the small oil lamp, enough to keep edges from going razor sharp. From the corner he took a length of charcoal once used for kindling fires. He put it in Jem's hand. The kitchen boards, dark and planed smooth by years, opened like a page waiting for a first line. Jem set the tip down. The first stroke broke in the middle where his hand shook. He pulled back, his fingers black with dust. Coulter didn't say, "Don't be afraid." He set 2 fingers at the boy's wrist to share the tremor and guided one hooked line down. J. The next stroke was a straight post. The A. Charcoal tipped and the line went slant. Coulter steadied it, brought it up plumb. Halfway he let go so the small hand could make the join. The cross pieces of the E wavered like a pond under a light wind, but they bit into the stem. The last M was hardest for a chest that needed air to push. The bandage made each peak steal an extra breath. Coulter counted with his eyes. 1, set, 2, lift, 3, down. When the last foot found the board, Jem didn't know when he'd held his breath. He only knew He could let it go now. 3 letters lay there, black and bold, edges freckled with coal dust, like dew. Coulter nudged the E a shade truer with his thumb and dusted the specks so the M wouldn't look saw-toothed. He didn't fix it past recognition. He left it belonging to the hand that made it. Jem rested both elbows on the board and stared as if he were looking for himself in water. Then he wrote it again beneath the first line. J-E-M. This time the J was finer, the E straighter, the M tighter. On the cup's bottom the carved dots kept still. On the kitchen board the charcoal letters were newborn. His name now had 2 shapes, one to keep, one to practice. Beside his elbow, the second cup breathed. The stitched leather warmed and took on a soft sheen. Jem set his wrist to the cup and felt his small pulse settle to the beat. He tipped his head and found the smoke stain on the ceiling and listened while the house answered in sounds. The stove saying, "Enough." The wind saying, "Easy." The board on the fence saying, "It's up." In his eyes, everything calmed in the way of someone who knows he is being waited for. After a while, Coulter lifted the cloth from the bowl. The dough had risen. The dent his hand had left an hour ago had domed like a wound closed clean. He pinched off a knob of old starter to feed, dribbled warm water, stirred, and set the jar back beside the cup. Jem pressed his fingertip to the charcoal mark on the glass and lifted it, leaving a black smudge on his skin. Small proof he'd touched something alive. Night deepened. The tang of sourdough and the coffee's dark joined like 2 footpaths meeting just before the porch. Coulter hung the charcoal on a nail and blew the dust from the board. The letters held their shape. No one needed to read them out. He turned the coffee so the seam wouldn't meet a lip and edged it toward Jem as he'd done the night before. The boy cupped it in both hands and didn't drink, letting the heat run down his wrists, into his chest, lock into the bandage and spread through a place that used to know only tightening. In the yard, insects came on shift for the birds. Day's gold dust fell to earth and settled into a fine coat on the steps. On the fence the sign went dark, but the letters stayed. Inside, the 3 letters on the board didn't smudge. The lamp drew a thin gold rim around them, enough that a small person waking in the night would still see his name exactly where it belonged. The starter kept breathing. The second cup kept warm. The stove kept its guard. And May's instruction, dropped as lightly as a pinch of flour, worked itself into every small chore and stayed there as the house's gentle law. Don't let the fire go out. Part 13. The man who turned his back on the saloon. High noon held still. Sun slid over the plank roof like a thin blade. In the kitchen, the sourdough jar breathed by the stove. Yesterday's charcoal mark had been passed by a finger's width of bubbles. Jem scraped flour from the rim of the bowl with the wooden spoon, his hands white with dust clear to the wrists. On the table, the tin cup with its stitched leather wrap lay beside him, a soot-dark J-E-M glinting on the bottom. On the porch, Coulter was changing the tie rope on the stall door, snugging the knot, listening to the gray horse blow in the shade. Hoofbeats slanted along the fence. Harlan Cobb stood at the gate like a shadow just out of rain. His coat had been snapped clean of coarse dust. His hair was slicked back with cold water. No tin flask hung at his hip. He wasn't riding. He led his horse. In the other hand, he cradled a sack of feed stamped with the Riverside mill. The mouth was closed with a blacksmith's knot, tight and neat. The warm smell of fresh cornmeal rose off it, kinder than anything that had ever come off the man himself. He stopped at the stall door. The step there had spooned down from boot heels over many seasons. Harlan set the sack down and tilted it so the corner settled inside the shade. His knee touched the plank edge without a loud report. He didn't call, didn't knock. He backed one step, leaving the space before the stall like a wordless message. Sheriff Dunn was making his round by the new posted sign. He checked his horse and let the pale bay mouth the bit a beat. His look slid from the board with its burned black letters to the feed sack by the stall, and then to the man who had pulled his hat down low. No move toward the cuffs, just a short nod, the way a man confirms a thing that's enough to begin and doesn't press an end. Coulter stepped out on the porch. He stood half a beat, wiping his hands on a rag like a man not quick to touch what's just arrived. His brim threw a belt of shade across the step. Sage came from the range and braided with feed and old leather into air that felt more decent than most days. In the doorway, Jem leaned out, a streak of flour on his cheek like a bright brush mark. He looked at the sack, then at Harlan, then at Coulter's big hand that hadn't gone out yet. Harlan shifted the rein to ease his horse back and smoothed the sack's mouth, like pressing down something frothy in the throat. He said nothing. In his breast pocket, the harmonica lay quiet. The stale yeast that used to travel with him wasn't there. In its place was lye soap and the clean metallic line of a blade freshly honed. Wind ticked the fence board once. Sheriff Dunn stroked the bay's neck and turned it toward the red road, leaving his nod behind like a seal without ink. Dust lifted in a thin film, settled on the brim of Harlan's hat and on the stitched leather at Jem's cup. For a moment everything ran to the same color, as if the town held its breath to finish a sentence. Coulter walked to the feed sack. He laid his hand on the carry loop and tested the weight. A white cord stood on his wrist and eased when the sack took its own stance. He drew it into the stall's shade without furrowing the sand. The motion neither accepted nor refused. It put a thing where a thing belonged, letting use speak in place of the bringer's intent. Jem set the spoon down, wiped his hands on the apron, ran to the threshold and stopped. The bandage under his shirt reminded him to keep the breath even. He looked up at Harlan, and his eyes settled on the thin scar at the cheekbone. Less harsh now that whiskey wasn't in the picture. Harlan pinched the hat brim a hand's width, not a greeting, only letting a stripe of cool run across his brow. For that instant his steel toes weren't aimed at anything. The gray in the stall poked its head out, sniffed the feed, and grunted its satisfaction. It rubbed its mane on the plank edge. A few hairs snagged on an old nail. In the kitchen, the jar domed a little more. Bubbles broke with the silent relief of someone letting go of what he's held too long. On the table, the second coffee cup kept warm by the stove. Steam veiled the edge where the leather seam lay. Harlan took another step back. No flask clinked. No sour reek hung on him. He stood one beat, breathing through his nose, and then turned his back to the saloon side of town. His hand didn't find the barroom bell the way it did most afternoons. The sheriff watched without signaling or writing. The act had made its own noise. Coulter crouched, slid the sack deeper into shade, and chalked it with a stone. He dropped the stall bar into its staple, not hard, like setting a lid on a pot that's just at the simmer. Then he straightened and watched the man walking toward the gate. No nod, no shake. His face didn't change, but a small twitch showed at the wrist, the same tendon that jumped when he tightened a rein for the right gait. Anyone who knew the man would read it for what it was. Acknowledgement enough. Jem went back to the kitchen, lifted the cup with his name cut into its bottom, cupped it in both hands so the heat ran into his wrists, then set it back in its old place, half an inch from the scratch on the board. He came out again and stood beside Coulter on the porch. Two shadows, one long, one short, fell across the steps without crossing anyone's path. They only lay there as the thin evidence of a quiet turning afternoon. At the gate, Harlan paused a half beat and looked back once, checking whether the feed sack had been left in the sun. Seeing it under shade, he went on. Gold dust rose behind his heels in a pale lift, just enough for the sky to note that a man had stepped out of an old habit. At the fence, the sheriff's board watched without judging, without threat. It only reminded them there was a line. The rest, what step to take, belonged to the man walking. When the hoofbeats had thinned to nothing, Coulter hauled the sack fully inside, picked the blacksmith's knot with the knife point, and poured a measure into the trough. Corn fell with a small, cool rain. He did not say thank you, forgiven, or from now on. He washed his hands at the trough. The cold bit his knuckles, and the words not needed rode off with the thin run of water. Evening leveled out. The fence threw a long shade. In the kitchen, the dough had risen to oven right. Jem brushed flour from the board and slid the cup aside to make room for the pan. Heat off the stove blurred the flour streak on his cheek. On the porch, the two of them stood without counting time and listened to hens turn in, to the horse chew its feed, to wind pull once at the new sign. All of it spoke one language, small change, clear enough. Harlan walked past the saloon. The feed lay in shade, and the second cup stood where it belonged, waiting on a different kind of full morning. Part 14, Chosen Family, opened toward the distance. The letter came on a morning veiled thin as muslin. Brown envelope, corner stamped with the town school seal, a small bell with a ribbon. Coulter split it with his jackknife. Purple ink and new paper breathed up between pine and saddle grease. Neat hand, an invitation for Jem to enroll in the fall. No promise attached, no talk of futures, just a nod written out. On the appointed morning, the chickens shifted on their roosts before light had settled. Inside, the fire was banked just enough to warm 2 tin cups, as always. Only today both were filled. The stitched cup sat on Jem's side, handle turned toward a small hand. The 3 cuts JEM on its bottom held a black flash of ash. Coulter poured slow, coffee broke into a thin wreath and did not spill. He edged the cup into the stove's glow and set it flush with the old half-inch mark from the scratch. Jem tied his laces, head tipped so the bandage wouldn't bite. The shoes had waited since last night, toes in, heels touching, like 2 stones bracing a cook stove. He knotted a snug bowline with an extra half-hitch, the habit of someone who used to run, still runs, only this time toward. He lifted the cup with his name and warmed it between his palms. Heat drew the numbness from his knuckles, climbed his wrists, paused at the bandage and softened a place that used to live in a curl. He took a short sip to warm his voice. The coffee smell braided with the dry ash on the cup's bottom into a scent only a house can own. Outside, the gray was already saddled. The cinch hole was the same notch as always. The silver conchos on the rig were dull shining but clean, touched with a fresh trace of hand grease. Coulter ran his hand along the saddle and smoothed the wool blanket so the wind couldn't catch an edge. On the fence, the sheriff's sign looked across the pasture. The black letters weren't a threat, only a quiet boundary. Small wooden wheels rattled. May Lark came by with her hair scarfed and flour on her apron. She handed over a crackle-crusted loaf wrapped in coarse cloth. The tip touched down in Jem's palm with a sturdy knock. No lecture, no counsel, just her thumb resting half a second on the back of his hand. A kind of blessing that doesn't need saying. The bread trailed its thin line of scent all the way to the gate. At the lane, Doc Pruitt waited with his handcart, the brim of his hat flattened by too many seasons of rain. He didn't examine or ask where it hurt. He gave the hat a wheel, set a small roll of lampwick and a packet of peppermint in parchment in Jem's lap, the sort of things you need if the wind ever turns. Sheriff Dunn rode by, didn't dismount, and touched his brim the way a man signs a paper that's already sure. Coulter barred the inside latch for one extra beat and opened it again. not forgetfulness, only letting the house hear the sound once more. He set his own cup by gems. 2 damp rings marked the wood, like 2 coins laid down and then lifted, the fee for a morning with one more person at the table. He slid the school envelope into his inside pocket and pressed it flat as a map. Out on the porch, gold dust hung low. The red road lay open like a long belt around the prairie's waist. Coulter tied May's starter jar to the saddle, the knot made easy to loose. Tomorrow it would need feeding. Jem settled in front, back straight as a sapling turning to the sun. He held the loaf to his chest, his thumb following a fissure in the crust and dabbing the flour that clung to skin. At the threshold, the 2 shadows, one long, one short, slanted across the boards and slid off the last step, joining in the yard like 2 runnels of water. Coulter's hand rested on the small shoulder and checked the strap beneath the shirt. His fingers stopped a beat exactly where the J on the cup's bottom had once warmed, touching an invisible seal, and then let go. The horse stepped out. Hooves marked 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, the known cadence. The fence sign fell back. The porch fell back. The second cup left 2 damp halos on the table to wait for their return and be filled again. The road lifted fine dust that stuck to trouser legs, to the saddle's edge, to the chin of someone who had just smiled into the wind. Past the sage flats and in at the town gate, the school bell hung under the eave. The yard was hard-packed. Faint chalk lines clung to the blackboard. E crooked, M open, the twin of the gem that had once shivered on the kitchen board. Jem closed his hand in his pocket around the remembered rim of the cup and pressed his palm to his shirt where his name lay under a thin film of sweat. 1 deep breath. The bandage no longer made him hold it. It only reminded him there was a time he had been short, and now he wasn't. They didn't go in at once. Coulter stopped under a birch, tied the horse. He smoothed Jem's coat and tipped his hat down against the light. His hand rested at the nape, not long enough for the small pulse to answer. He didn't say, "Go on." He stepped back and left the space in front the easy way for a small person to take it. Across the yard, May stepped from the bakery's porch with a tray for first-day children. Doc Pruitt leaned on a post and lifted his hat when Jem's eyes found his. Sheriff Dunn stood by the bell post, touched his brim, and let it fall. All those small motions linked into a plank bridge over a shallow stretch of water. Jem stepped. A fine stripe of dust jumped and fell. The classroom door stood ajar, chalk new desk wood, paper. He glanced back for a half-beat. Coulter stood there, brim low, the long shadow beside the short one that had just left. He gave a nod. Not big, not urging, just enough for the name inside that boy to know it had come to the right spot. The day went on. The sun leaned. When they came home, the 2 damp rings on the table had dried to pale bands, like the way a ring leaves a faint mark after haying season. The second cup was washed and set back in its place. The starter was fed. The charcoal mark rose another notch. The fence board still stood, unweathered. Everything repeated like a spare tune that doesn't wear out. At night, before the lamp was turned low, Jem set the stitched cup exactly on its mark. Coulter turned the handle toward him and nudged it a half-inch. A quiet invitation for morning. On the porch, wind went past the saddle and left a thread of warm leather and coffee, a thin smoke line strung from stove to bed. No one named what to call the bond. The smell said it. From now on, there is a home. And the red road out there is wide enough for 2 shadows, one long, one short, to keep sliding outward each morning and back each evening unhurried, steady as a hearth fire that only asks someone to remember one more stick. When dusk lowers the gold dust to the ground, the porch cools. The coffee cup, with its stitched leather rim, goes cold slowly, leaving a faint ring on the table. Saddle leather sourdough and sage braid together like a prayer that needs no words. Two shadows, one long, one short, slide across the steps and come to rest. No one needs to call a name. It's enough to know that from now on, someone will remember to feed the stove, and the chipped rim cup will always be filled first. If some small detail in this story made you slow down, a loaf cracking as it finished, the tax light jingle, a hand settling on the door bar, leave one word below. Just one. Stay, forgive, home. Or tell me about the second cup in your life. I'll read slowly the way folks out west warm their hands by the stove to be sure that we, dust-worn as we may be, still have a place to come back to.